where people weren't writers particularly. They were bankers or lawyers or chemical engineers. And going to the school today made me think about, like, when did I discover I was a writer? Yeah. And who was I reading that made me want to be a writer? I mean, did you always know you were a writer?
Oh no, but it's funny. I mean, this is actually, I think, a part of Elissa's history I don't know super well. It's a little embarrassing. I did always want to be a writer, but I certainly didn't know that it was possible to make a living writing fiction. I think I grew up in Miami, so Dave Barry was, to me, I love Dave Barry. And so I would read, yeah, my favorite book when I was 10 was like Dave Barry Turns 40. I was like, it is so true what he says about balding and golf. I was like, amen, sir. You know, and I was like, so maybe you could write a humor column. To me, that was like, journalism seemed like the lucrative way to, so, you know, I did like the newspaper in high school and things like that, but I loved fiction always. And my ambition to be a writer sort of grew at pace with reading. I mean, exactly at pace. So when I was 6, I was writing these like doomed stories.
Oh, yes.
All of which have the same, like, I never got any more sophisticated about plot. It's all like, once upon a time there was a valley of magical bears, you know, new paragraph, then there was a flood. So like, it was always, I mean, but that was, you know, that is sort of the standard two-step. It's like a stable context and here comes a rock.
But do you consider what you write fantasy? Because for me, there's, I mean, I think of you as being so much like George Saunders, that there's like the surrealist element, but it's all pulled together by these very recognizable human emotions and experiences.
Yeah, it's funny, right? I get that.
So I never understand that when people say that.
I get the heebie-jeebies a little bit, but I mean, some of those books that I loved, it didn't seem so much weirder than, so my mom would say, okay, cool, get Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, right, but you also have to read Jane Eyre. Okay, in the opening of Jane Eyre, that girl is locked in a red room with a ghost. I mean, and it only gets weirder. Right. So I somehow think like those distinctions start to feel kind of false to me sometimes. You know, you're always like in this imaginary world. It's not like that's not some compressed, distorted world. It's language on a page, you know. So it's interesting. And I think with Saunders, Saunders was someone who was so, this is George Saunders who's getting all this like warranted praise right now. But he's somebody who I think is fed by genre streams, you know, all kinds of different streams. Right. And that's, to me, that feels so much truer about, you know, just what it's like to be alive.
So while I was working on this terrible novel, I was also writing all these short stories. Mm-hmm. And I had just had a daughter, and I was thinking about the world in a very different way. And so I'd started to write these stories basically as a way to just figure out, what the hell am I doing? And to put that down. But they didn't feel legitimate to me because they were just these stories about these women. And that was a problem for me. And it wasn't until I had this voice of this one young woman in my head who is a big party girl in the book. She's a sorority girl who gets into all sorts of trouble. I mean, serious trouble. And she kept saying, why don't you write about me? Why don't you write about me? And I don't always hear voices. Stories do not always come to me in the voice of a character. I said that once to a shrink.
That's like making lemonade too, right? I'm like, let's make this mild schizophrenia work for us.
That's right, that's right. Work in the direction of your strengths. And no, so she was saying, why don't you write about me? Why don't you write about me? And I said, well, I don't want to write about you because you're a ridiculous human being and you have nothing to say. And in that moment, I thought, you are such a hypocrite. You're writing these stories about women's lives, writing about like what we don't know about women, and you're going to tell this young woman that her story doesn't matter? And I wrote her story, and that story is like what created the whole book for me. Is I thought, okay, I know what I'm doing now. All these people that we think we know, that we dismiss, I want to write their story. I want to tell you what you don't know about them.
I often get the coming of age label. I think because my protagonists tend to be young women. Yeah, really young women, sort of right at that threshold. Right. And I know you get this too. And I just think people, maybe we're wrong, but I always think it conjures sort of a Judy Blume, acne and periods kind of. I don't know, like that's. And for me, it was. I really wanted this to be a much bigger story, sort of not even just about this one family, but sort of about South Florida generally. A lot of the mourning in the book, which is connected to their mother, I sort of saw as really an ecological kind of mourning. I grew up in Miami in the 80s when everyone's contending with development, you know, the sickening velocity of the change where we've like basically destroyed a millennial ecosystem in a couple generations. Right. So And there's this great quote that I know that we both have stolen from Antonia Nelson about coming of age. Let me see if I botch it. You can jump in.
No, I'll try.
But she basically said all stories are coming of age stories when you think about it, because a character is confronted with a new event, some change in equilibrium, and they have to assimilate that, or die. I mean, they have to assimilate that into their being. They have to come of age insofar as they're taking that into their worldview and their bodies and then moving beyond it. So, I mean, in this case, I was thinking about just grief, just Dante's Inferno, right? Just moving through the hell of grieving for someone you've lost and trying to, some myth has been shattered and now you have to figure out how to tell a new story to accommodate this new reality. So it is, I guess, a coming of age, but it was familial and then also sort of, I just think even culturally, so just that regionally, South Florida, trying to deal with what we've wrought, figure out a new story.
I've cried a lot when I write. I've had to write, in this recent book, had to write about a couple who have been trying and trying and trying to have a child, and she has a miscarriage, and their relationship is not very good. They're both very lonely in their marriage, and they get a dog, and the dog becomes ill, and they have to put the dog to sleep. And I sobbed writing the end of that story when those people had to put that dog to sleep.
I think that's a funny thing too. I know you get this a lot, right, from readers who are like, why do you do those mean things to your characters, as if you're like this puppeteer of horrors?
It's like not mean. It's like, it's like people ask, yes, it's not mean. It happens all the time. It's sad. It's really sad. And I'm not interested in writing really happy stories. Other people do that a lot better. I want to write about those moments where nothing is ever the same again. And I want to write stories that, yes, make people uncomfortable, because there are a whole lot of people who feel uncomfortable in the world who read the same stories and say, thank you for writing that story. I didn't think anybody else felt that way. Or I would never admit that I felt ambivalent about having a child. Or I would never admit that I was lonely in my marriage. And so that's why I write.
With this book, and I'm sure that there are things that could be different about it, but it was I struggled with it for so long. And there's sort of so many different worlds that I was trying to juggle that I got to like a Jenga place where I just felt like, okay, maybe one piece is sticking out a little weird, but I'm not even going to touch it. Like at last, I just felt like there was some kind of equilibrium, and I had gotten to the ending that felt like the most genuinely happy ending I could land on for this particular family, where it felt like opening. It didn't feel like anything was really shut down, but for me, it felt like the right resolution. So but beyond that
Did you know it when you wrote it, though? When you got to that place?
In like the first draft, that was the best feeling, when I got to sort of through an ending. And actually, I kind of felt like the real ending, or like where I was like, okay, now there's a scene where she sort of is in discussion, in dialogue with her mother, not like a ghost, like a Bill Cosby ghost, dad ghost, but just in dialogue with the spirit of her mother. And that is kind of the buoyancy that saves her. And that felt like the correct.
Because I do think sometimes you get gifts like that. I knew the last line of my book, even though it wasn't what I was writing towards. I just thought, oh, the last line is, there's no such thing as just a girl. And I was like, oh, that's the last line. I wasn't anywhere near done with the book.
Right. But that is such a gift, right? Because then it's pleasurable to move forward.
But then you think, oh, the universe, you're not against me.